In European royal history, there were arranged marriages for power and marriages for money. But the marriage of Marie Bonaparte, Europe's richest woman, and Prince George of Greece belonged to a much darker category. History books called it the wedding of the century, but those involved secretly called it a play. As Marie walked down the aisle in her diamond-studded gown, she believed she was entering a fairy tale. Little did she know that at the banquet table on their travels, and most hauntingly in her husband's mind, another person was always present. Not a secret mistress, not a past love, but a man. And painfully it was her husband's uncle. If you look at their family photos, you usually see three people, Marie, George, and Prince Valdemar. Marie pays for the parties. George holds Valdemar's hand, and the world calls it royal happiness. Welcome to the story of the strangest Lavender Marriage of the 20th century. This is the story of Marie Bonaparte using her vast casino fortune to buy a prince, only to discover that his heart was already mortgaged to someone else. This isn't a typical love triangle. This is a three-in-a-bed scandal. To understand how one of the most intelligent princesses of her time accepted becoming an outsider in her own marriage, we must go back to the beginning, not to love, but to money. In the late 19th century, the name Blanc was synonymous with immense, scandalous wealth. Marie's maternal grandfather was Francois Blanc, the Wizard of Monte Carlo. He was the man who transformed a rocky outcrop in Monaco into the gambling capital of the world. This was not old money. It was not respectable landed gentry money. It was sin money. It was cash accumulated from the ruin of aristocrats, the suicides of desperate gamblers, and the turning of the roulette wheel. When Marie was born, she inherited this complicated legacy. She was arguably the wealthiest heiress in Europe, but money in the 19th century was a double-edged sword for a woman. It made her a target. It turned her into a commodity before she could even speak. The tragedy begins before she takes her first breath. Her mother, Marie Félix Blanc, was a fragile woman who died of an embolism just days after Marie's birth. This is the fatal weakness that was implanted in Marie's psyche from day one: guilt. Her father, Prince Roland Bonaparte, was devastated by the loss of his wife. He did not hide his resentment. Marie grew up with the unspoken and sometimes spoken accusation hanging over her head. You killed her. You took her place. Your life was bought with her death. Imagine the psychological landscape of a child who believes she is a murderer simply by existing. This creates a deep-seated belief that she does not deserve happiness, and specifically that she does not deserve pleasure. If your birth caused death, then surely your joy must be a sin? This is the root of the frigidity that would torment her later life. Let's look at the father, Prince Roland Bonaparte. Roland was a man obsessed with science, geography, and anthropology. He wanted to be taken seriously as an intellectual, to wash away the stain of being a Bonaparte and a husband of casino money. He treated his home like a laboratory and his daughter like a failed experiment. Marie was raised in a silent palace. There were no toys, no chaotic play dates, no warm embraces. There were only servants, governesses, and the terrifying looming presence of her grandmother, Madame Blanc. Madame Blanc was a formidable woman who controlled the purse strings. She despised the Bonaparte, viewing them as impoverished upstarts who had married her daughter for money. She viewed Marie as a fragile vessel that contained the family fortune. The result was an atmosphere of vivid visuals. A little girl wandering through vast marble halls filled with busts of Napoleon and dusty books, forbidden to run, forbidden to shout, forbidden to touch. She was surrounded by adults who spoke in whispers about interest rates and dividends. She was the richest orphan in the world, starving, for a single touch of affection. In this vacuum of affection, Marie's mind began to turn inward. She developed intense, terrifying phobias. This is the detective work of psychoanalysis, tracing the adult neurosis back to the nursery fears. She was terrified of buttons. She was terrified of drafts. She was terrified of the dark. But her most significant obsession was with her own body. Without a mother to explain the world, and with a father who was distant, Marie became obsessively curious about anatomy and sex. But in the Victorian era, sex was a taboo, a black hole of silence. She wrote in her later journals about a recurring nightmare she had as a child. She dreamed of a talk, a menacing figure or sensation that threatened to engulf her. Freud would later analyze this as a manifestation of her sexual anxiety. But we don't need to be Freud to see the tragedy here. Here was a child with a high intellect and a high drive for connection, trapped in a world that offered her neither. She began to believe that there was something physically wrong with her. Why doesn't Papa love me? Why did Mama die? It must be because I am defective. This is the seed of the psychological taboo. She began to dissociate from her body. She viewed her body not as a source of joy, but as a source of shame and danger. This dissociation is the precursor to the anorgasmia that would define her adult life. She learned to shut down her physical sensations because feeling them was too terrifying. As Marie grew older, the nature of her existence shifted. She stopped being a nuisance and became an asset. By the time she was a teenager, it was clear that she would inherit millions. The vultures began to circle. Prince Roland, her father, suddenly took an interest in her, not as a daughter, but as a pawn. He wanted to use her marriage to elevate his own status. The Bonapartes were imperial royalty, but they were out of power. Roland wanted to marry her into a reigning royal house to secure his legitimacy. Marie was educated rigorously. She learned languages, history, and literature, but she was socially stunted. She had no friends her own age. She had never flirted with a boy. She had never held hands. She was a brain floating in a jar of gold. This creates a drama-filled contradiction. She was arguably the most eligible bachelorette in Europe. Every prince, duke, and count wanted to marry her. But inside, she felt like a monster. She felt unlovable. She believed that anyone who wanted to marry her was only doing it for the Blanc money. And the tragedy is, she was right. We must also consider the weight of her last name, Bonaparte. Being a Bonaparte in the late 19th century was a complex burden. It meant you were associated with glory, genius, and power. But it also meant you were viewed with suspicion. The monarchies of Europe viewed the Bonapartes as usurpers and revolutionaries. Marie felt this exclusion. She was a princess, but she wasn't real royalty in the eyes of the snobs. She was casino royalty. This created a chip on her shoulder. She wanted to prove them wrong. She wanted to be more royal than the royals. This ambition would drive her into the arms of Prince George of Greece. She didn't choose him for love. She chosen him because he was a royal highness. He was the son of a king. Marrying him would wash away the casino stain. She was using her wealth to buy a new identity, hoping that the title of Princess of Greece and Denmark would finally make her feel whole. She is 18 years old. She is intelligent, intense, and profoundly lonely. She has begun to read medical texts in her father's library, secretly searching for answers about her own body. She reads about anatomy, about reproduction, trying to solve the mystery of why she feels so dead inside. She is already exhibiting the traits of the obsessive scientist she would later become. But she is also a romantic. Deep down, she hopes that a man, a Prince Charming, will come and wake her up. She hopes that marriage will be the magic spell that cures her. She hopes that physical intimacy will break the wall of isolation. She doesn't know that she is about to walk into a trap. She doesn't know that the Prince Charming she has set her sights on, Prince George of Greece, is incapable of loving her in the way she needs. She doesn't know that she is trading the cold isolation of her father's house for the bizarre, twisted isolation of a lavender marriage. She stands at the window of her palace in Paris, looking out at a world she owns but cannot touch. The richest girl in the world is about to buy the biggest mistake of her life. We often think of privilege as a shield. Money protects you from hunger, from cold, from labor. But Marie Bonaparte's life proves that money can also be a prison. Her wealth made her paranoid. It made her question the motives of everyone around her. It isolated her from normal human experiences. And most dangerously, it allowed her to indulge her obsessions. If she had been a poor woman, she might have had to work, to struggle, to connect with others to survive. She might have found a rough, imperfect, but real happiness. But because she was rich, she could afford to stay in her head. She could afford to be neurotic. She could afford to treat her life as a theoretical problem to be solved rather than a life to be lived. Her wealth was the fuel for her future tragedy. It gave her the means to destroy herself and the means to sustain a fake life. The curse of the casino wasn't just about the dirty origin of the money. It was about the fact that the money froze her in time. It made her a permanent spectator to her own existence. The stage is set. The golden orphan is ready to be sold. The buyers are lining up. And stepping to the front of the line is a tall, handsome, imposing man, Prince George of Greece, the High Commissioner of Crete, a hero, a giant. Marie looks at him and sees a god. She doesn't see the man standing in his shadow. She doesn't see Prince Valdemar of Denmark, the uncle who holds George's heart in a grip of iron. She thinks she is entering a romance. She is actually entering a triangle. And in this triangle, she is the only one who doesn't know the rules of the game. In the lexicon of royal history, there is a term that is rarely spoken aloud but frequently whispered: a lavender marriage. It is a union designed to hide the sexual orientation of one or both partners. It is a stage play where the actors recite lines of devotion while looking past each other into the wings. In 1907, the wealthiest heiress in Europe, Marie Bonaparte, walked down the aisle to marry Prince George of Greece. It was hailed as the wedding of the century. She was bringing the Napoleonic glory and the Monte Carlo millions. He was bringing the ancient blood of kings and the physical stature of a Greek god. To the cheering crowds in Athens, it looked like a fairy tale. But to the forensic historian, it looks like a business transaction built on a lie. Marie thought she was marrying a hero who would awaken her sleeping body. Prince George thought he was acquiring a banker who would fund his lifestyle. Neither of them realized that there was a third person in the marriage, a shadow that would never leave their bed. This is the story of how Marie Bonaparte bought herself a prince, only to discover that his heart was already mortgaged to another man, his own uncle. This is the anatomy of a lavender marriage. To understand why this marriage happened, we must follow the money. By 1906, Marie Bonaparte was 24 years old. In the marriage market of the Belle Epoque, she was practically a spinster, but she was a spinster sitting on a mountain of gold. Her father, Prince Roland, was desperate to marry her off to a reigning house to legitimize the Bonaparte name. He was shopping her around Europe like a prize mare. Enter Prince George of Greece and Denmark. George was 37 years old. He was a man of immense physical presence, tall, muscular, with a handlebar mustache and a booming voice. He was a national hero in Russia. He was the High Commissioner of Crete. He was the epitome of masculine royalty. But George had a problem. He was broke. The Greek royal family was notoriously poor. They had titles, but they lived on the charity of their wealthier relatives in Denmark and Russia. George needed a wife, not for companionship, but for liquidity. When they met in Paris, the dynamic was set. Marie looked at George and saw everything she wasn't. She was small, neurotic, and intellectual. He was giant, physical, and simple. She projected all her romantic fantasies onto him. She saw him as a Greek god who would crush her fears and dominate her anxieties. George looked at Marie and saw a solution to his debts. He was blunt, unromantic, and awkward with women, but he saw the blanc money, and he agreed to the deal. It was a classic drama-filled contradiction. She was marrying for a fantasy of passion. He was marrying to avoid poverty. Let us analyze the character of Prince George. To the public, he was the ultimate alpha male. He was a sailor, a soldier, a man who could bend coins with his fingers. He spoke in a loud, gruff manner. He despised books and intellectuals. But this hypermasculinity was a mask, or perhaps a compensation. George was totally, irrevocably, emotionally dependent on one person, Prince Valdemar of Denmark. Valdemar was George's uncle, but the relationship was not avuncular. It was passionate. Since George was a teenager sent to the Danish Navy, he had been inseparable from Valdemar. They lived together, traveled together, and wrote letters to each other that, even by the sentimental standards of the 19th century, are explicitly romantic. George called Valdemar my beloved, my soul, my only one. When George was forced to go to Crete or Russia, he fell into deep depressions, crying like a child for his uncle Valdemar. This is the psychological taboo at the heart of the story. In 1907, homosexuality was criminalized and socially fatal, but within the insulated world of European royalty, it was often an open secret. As long as you did your duty, married a woman and produced heirs, you could do what you wanted in the shadows. George didn't want a wife. He wanted to stay with Valdemar. But Valdemar, who was older and more pragmatic, pushed George to marry Marie. Why? Because Valdemar knew George needed money. So the other man actually orchestrated the marriage. This twist adds a layer of cruelty to Marie's fate. She wasn't just competing with a lover. She was being managed by him. The engagement period was bizarre. Marie, starving for affection, tried to talk to George about art, about her feelings, about her fears. George would stare at her blankly or laugh. He had zero interest in her inner life. He wrote to Valdemar daily, pouring his heart out. To Marie, he barely wrote a postcard. Marie interpreted his distance as royal reserve or masculine strength. She convinced herself that under that gruff exterior lay a burning passion waiting to be unleashed. She was rewriting reality to fit her obsession. She wrote in her diary about her desire to be conquered by him. Her frigidity, she believed, was just a lock waiting for the right key. And surely this giant of a man was the key. Marie is dressed in the height of fashion, looking up at him with intense, searching eyes. George is looking at his watch, wondering when he can go back to his club. They were two different species trying to communicate. November 21st, 1907. Athens. The wedding was a spectacle of blinding luxury. This is where the wealth obsession takes center stage. Marie's father, Prince Roland, paid for everything. He practically showered Athens in gold. The guest list was a who's who of Europe, the King of England, the Tsar of Russia, the Kaiser of Germany. Marie wore a dress embroidered with silver and pearls. She wore the Bonaparte diamond tiaras. To the world, she had arrived. The casino girl was now Her Royal Highness. But as she walked down the aisle, the tragedy was already in motion. Standing right next to the groom, in the place of honor, was Prince Valdemar. George looked at Valdemar with tears in his eyes. Marie looked at George. It was a triangle playing out at the altar of God. The priest chanted the liturgy. The crowds cheered Zito. But the contract had been signed in bad faith. Marie was promising her body to a man who didn't want it. George was promising his heart to a woman he couldn't love. We now arrive at the most painful moment of the story, the moment that shattered Marie's psyche and defined the rest of her life, the wedding night. For a Victorian woman, this was the moment of truth. For Marie, obsessed with her own anatomy and terrified of her defect, the stakes were impossibly high. She expected pain, yes, but she also expected transformation. She expected the talk to be exorcised by the power of sex. The reality was a catastrophe. Prince George was clumsy, dutiful, and fundamentally uninterested. He performed the act as if it were a military drill. There was no foreplay, no tenderness, no passion. For George, it was a chore he had to finish so he could go to sleep. For Marie, it was a physical and emotional assault, not because it was violent, but because it was empty. She felt nothing, no pleasure, no connection, only a cold, mechanical friction. When it was over, George rolled over and went to sleep. Marie lay awake in the dark. The detective in her mind began to work. Why didn't I feel anything? Is it because he doesn't love me? Or is it because I am broken? The disaster of the wedding night confirmed her deepest fear. I am dead down there. She didn't blame George. She blamed herself. She blamed her casino blood. She blamed her mother's death. This moment triggered the obsession that would lead her to the operating table years later. She believed the problem was physiological. She didn't realize the problem was that she was sleeping with a gay man who was thinking of his uncle. If the wedding night was a tragedy, the honeymoon was a farce. They traveled to Egypt and around Europe. And guess who came with them? Prince Valdemar. It is almost unbelievable, but historical records confirm it. The honeymoon was a trio. George spent his days with Valdemar. They laughed, they joked, they reminisced about the Navy. Marie sat alone on the deck of the yacht reading books. She was the third wheel on her own honeymoon. It was during this trip that the veil finally lifted. Marie was intelligent. She watched the way George looked at Valdemar. She saw the tenderness that was completely absent from her own marriage. She realized the truth. She wasn't competing with another woman. She wasn't competing with a lack of libido. She was competing with a biological orientation. Her husband loved in. For most women of that era, this would be grounds for a breakdown. But Marie Bonaparte was different. This is where her philosophy kicks in. Instead of leaving him, she accepted it. Why? Because the wealth/status trade-off was too valuable to lose. She liked being Her Royal Highness. She liked the prestige. And in a twisted way, George's homosexuality relieved her of the pressure to perform sexually. If he didn't want her, she didn't have to fail at pleasing him. She decided to strike a bargain with reality. She would accept Valdemar. She would accept the Lavender Marriage. In exchange, she would live her own life. She would use her money to buy her own freedom. Marie Bonaparte was a casualty of the homophobia of the early 20th century. If George had been free to love Valdemar openly, he never would have married Marie. Marie would have been free to find a man who desired her. Instead, society forced them into a cage together. George was the jailer who didn't want to be there. Marie was the prisoner who paid for the construction of the prison. Their marriage became a hollow shell. They produced 2 children out of sheer duty, likely through joyless, mechanical encounters. But the emotional bond was dead on arrival. By 1908, Marie Bonaparte knew her marriage was a sham. She was a princess, but she was a sexual orphan. The immense energy she had directed toward George, the hope for romance, for cure, for connection, had hit a wall. So like water flowing around a rock, That energy changed direction. If she couldn't find pleasure in her marriage, she would find it elsewhere. And if she couldn't find it with a lover, she would find it with science. The failure of the Lavender Marriage was the direct catalyst for her transformation into the obsessional scientist. She began to view her sexuality as a medical problem to be solved. She started to look for lovers, not for romance, but for experiments. She was about to embark on a frantic, decades-long hunt for the orgasm that George couldn't give her. The Golden Princess was about to become the desperate patient. In most marriages, the other person is a secret. They are hidden in shadows, kept in separate apartments, and visited in the dead of night. But in the marriage of Marie Bonaparte and Prince George of Greece, the other person sat at the breakfast table. He went on vacations with them. He was the first person George spoke to in the morning, and the last person he wrote to at night. This invisible third was Prince Valdemar of Denmark, George's uncle. For Marie Bonaparte, the richest woman in Europe, this was the ultimate humiliation that her money couldn't fix. She had bought a prince, but the prince came as a package deal with his male lover. To understand the suffocation Marie felt, we must first profile Prince Valdemar of Denmark. Valdemar was the youngest son of King Christian IX. He was a naval officer, handsome, charming, and deeply beloved by his family. But to Prince George, Valdemar was not just an uncle. He was a god. When George was a teenager, he was sent to the Danish Navy to be toughened up. He was placed under Valdemar's care. Valdemar became his father figure, his best friend, and the object of his absolute emotional devotion. Whether their relationship was physically sexual in the explicit sense is a matter for historical debate, but emotionally, it was a marriage. George was psychologically fused with Valdemar. When Marie entered the picture, she was an intruder. Imagine the vivid visuals of their daily life. They are on the royal yacht. George and Valdemar are standing at the rail, laughing at inside jokes, reminiscing about naval battles, speaking in Danish, a language Marie didn't know well. They touch each other's shoulders with an ease that George never showed Marie. Marie sits on a deck chair a few feet away, holding a book she isn't reading. She is wearing diamonds that cost millions, but she feels like a pauper. She is the financier of the trip, the owner of the yacht, but she is treated like a guest who has overstayed her welcome. Why did she stay? This is the central question of the psychological taboo. A modern woman would have filed for divorce. A Victorian woman might have had a nervous breakdown. Marie Bonaparte did something different. She intellectualized it. She treated her marriage like a scientific specimen. She observed the dynamic between George and Valdemar with a detached clinical eye. She realized that George was a child trapped in a giant's body. He needed Valdemar to function. Without Valdemar, George was moody, aggressive, and lost. With Valdemar, he was happy. Marie decided that a happy gay husband was easier to manage than an unhappy straight one. Furthermore, her acceptance was rooted in her own fatal weakness, her obsession with her own frigidity. Deep down, Marie was terrified of sex, her childhood trauma, her mother's death, her talk nightmares. It all made intimacy frightening. George's homosexuality was, in a twisted way, a relief. If he loved Valdemar, he wouldn't demand intense sexual performance from her. He wouldn't notice that she didn't orgasm. He wouldn't pry into her secrets. She accepted the invisible third because Valdemar acted as a buffer. He stood between Marie and the terrifying intimacy of a real marriage. She used her husband's taboo to hide her own. However, acceptance came with a price tag. The dynamic shifted. Marie became the golden ATM for the Greek royal family. Prince George and his brothers were always short of cash. The Greek monarchy was unstable. Marie's blanc money became the foundation of their lifestyle. She paid for the houses. She paid for the vacations. She paid for the education of the children. In exchange for this financial bailout, she bought her title and her freedom. George allowed her to pursue her intellectual interests. He allowed her to travel. He allowed her to be eccentric. It was a transactional peace treaty. I will pay for your life with Valdemar, and you will let me be Her Royal Highness, Princess Marie. But money cannot buy warmth. The evenings in their palace were silent. George would play solitaire or write to Valdemar. Marie would sit at her desk, writing in her journals, cataloging her misery. She wrote about the great coldness that surrounded her. She was the richest woman in the room, but she was starving to death emotionally. By 1910, the loneliness had become unbearable. Marie was 28. She was healthy, intelligent, and curious. The acceptance of Valdemar was a logical decision, but the human body is not logical. It has needs. Marie began to wonder, is it just George? Am I frigid with everyone or just with him? Is my body dead or is it just sleeping? She needed an experiment. She needed a control group. She needed a lover. But Marie Bonaparte didn't just pick up a stable boy or a guard. Her wealth/status obsession dictated that her lovers must be men of consequence. She was a Bonaparte. She wouldn't sleep with a nobody. She set her sights on Aristide Briand, the Prime Minister of France. This choice is fascinating. Briand was not a handsome prince. He was older, rumpled, a socialist politician with a drooping mustache, but he was powerful. He was an intellectual equal. He was a man of words. Marie thought, George is a body without a mind. Briand is a mind with a body. Maybe he is the key. The affair with Aristide Briand began. It was scandalous. A princess and a prime minister. Marie threw herself into it with the intensity of a scientist conducting a critical trial. She waited for the earth to move. She waited for the talk to vanish. She waited for the orgasm. And nothing happened. She enjoyed the conversation. She enjoyed the power of being the mistress of a great man. But physically, she remained anorgasmic. She felt the same numbness she felt with George. This was a catastrophic realization for her. If she couldn't feel pleasure with a man she respected, a man who desired her, then the problem wasn't the man. The problem was her. The detective in her mind concluded, I am biologically defective. She began to obsess over her anatomy. She looked in mirrors. She compared herself to medical diagrams. She became convinced that her clitoris was too far from her vagina. This is where the psychological taboo shifts from a marital issue to a medical obsession. She stopped looking for a lover to cure her. She started looking for a surgeon. While this internal drama was raging, Marie maintained a flawless public facade. She was the dutiful princess. She attended the coronations. She wore the tiaras. During the Balkan Wars, she even acted the part of the war nurse. She used her money to equip a hospital ship for the Greek Navy. She sailed into the war zone. This was Marie trying to find meaning through action. If she couldn't be a woman, she would be a hero. There are photos of her in a nurse's uniform, looking stern and efficient. But even in the war zone, the irony persisted. She was funding the war for her husband's family, a husband who was writing letters to his uncle while she was bandaging wounded soldiers. She was the angel of the battlefield, but she couldn't heal her own wound. As we analyze this period of her life, we see the crystallization of her neurosis. Marie Bonaparte had everything: wealth, title, fame, lovers. But she had nothing. This confirms the philosophical idea that desire is built on lack. You want what you don't have. Marie didn't want money. She didn't want fame. She wanted the one thing that biology had denied her: a normal sexual response. Because she couldn't have it, it became the center of her universe. It became her religion. She began to view all of human history, all of art, all of civilization through the lens of sex. She was becoming a Freudian before she even met Freud. The invisible third had pushed her out of her marriage. The failure with Briand had pushed her out of romance. She was now alone in a void. And in that void, a dangerous idea began to take root. If my mind cannot fix my body, maybe a knife can. In 1924, a strange and unsettling article appeared in the hushed, dusty archives of European medical journals. It was written by an author with the cryptic pseudonym A.E. Narjany. The paper was a cold, clinical, and ruthless analysis of the anatomical causes of frigidity in women, filled with charts and measurements precise to the millimeter, detailing the distance between the clitoris and the vagina. The medical establishment assumed A.E. Narjany was an eccentric male doctor, perhaps a statistician with a bizarre hobby. They were wrong. A.E. Narjany was Princess Marie Bonaparte, the wealthiest woman in Europe, the great-grandniece of Napoleon, and the wife of a Greek prince, was secretly using her own body and the bodies of hundreds of other women as a laboratory experiment. This chapter is the story of a desperate journey into the darkness of early sexology. It chronicles the moment when a princess took off her crown, not to make love, but to pick up a ruler and measure her own pain. It is the transition from the romantic disappointments of the bedroom to the cold, hard light of the clinic. Welcome to the laboratory of obsession. To understand the sheer scale of Marie's obsession, we must act as detectives reviewing her love diary between 1910 and 1920. After the failure of her affair with the French Prime Minister Aristide Briand, a normal woman might have retreated into celibacy or accepted her fate. Marie Bonaparte did the opposite. She launched herself into a frenetic series of affairs. But we must be careful with our terminology here. These were not romances, they were clinical trials. She slept with her surgeon, with painters, with politicians. To the gossip columnists of Paris, she was a scandalous socialite, a merry widow with a living husband. But internally, Marie was approaching these men with the detached eye of a forensic scientist. Each man was a new variable in her grand experiment. She constantly asked herself if a different man might possess a better technique, or if a different anatomy might finally unlock the sensation she craved. She wondered if the angle or the setting could be the missing key to her release. She recorded these experiences with terrifying precision, yet the result was always the same. Absolute zero. There was no orgasm, no talk, her childhood term for the overwhelming sensation she feared and craved. There was only friction and a growing, suffocating sense of inadequacy. This is the tragedy of the female Don Juan. A male Don Juan conquers women to affirm his ego, but Marie Bonaparte conquered men to search for a biological reaction that her body refused to give her. Her immense wealth became a curse in this specific context because it made men easily available. She never lacked for volunteers, but she perpetually lacked results. She began to believe she was truly cursed, feeling that the dirty money of the Blanc Casino empire had turned her into a golden doll, beautiful, expensive, and completely hollow inside. In 1924, a pivotal event occurred that changed the trajectory of her life. Her father, Prince Roland Bonaparte, died. For a dutiful daughter, this would be a tragedy, but for Marie, it was an emancipation. Roland was the architect of her loneliness. The man who had treated her like a specimen sold her into a loveless marriage, and whose cold scientific worldview had shaped her neuroses. His death unlocked the final psychological shackle. Marie was now 42 years old, in sole possession of one of the largest fortunes in the world, and finally had no one left to answer to. It was in this moment of newfound freedom that she stumbled upon a book titled Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis, written by a controversial Viennese doctor named Sigmund Freud. When Marie read these pages, she felt a shock of recognition that was almost physical. Freud wrote about dreams, the sexual traumas of childhood, and the complex, often poisonous relationships between fathers and daughters. Marie felt as though Freud had walked into her mind and turned on the lights. She realized that the enemy she had fought all her life, the phobias, the nightmares, the frigidity, was not a ghost, but a repressed psychological knot. She found a new, intoxicating hope that perhaps the problem wasn't her body, as she had always feared, but her mind. And if it was her mind, then surely it could be fixed. With the decisiveness and arrogance of the super-rich, Marie decided she must see Freud immediately. She used her network to contact him in Vienna, but she hit a wall. Sigmund Freud, by the mid-1920s, was famous, aging, and suffering from the painful cancer of the jaw that would eventually kill him. He was notoriously skeptical of the aristocracy, viewing wealthy socialites as tourists in the world of psychoanalysis, bored women who wanted a new hobby to replace their spa treatments. When he heard a princess wanted to see him, he reportedly dismissed the idea, claiming he had no time for a bored princess. But Marie Bonaparte was not used to hearing the word no. She deployed her most effective weapons, persistence and money. She didn't bribe him directly, as Freud was too proud for that, but she signaled her absolute seriousness. She wrote letters proving she had read his entire corpus of work, making it clear she was not coming to be entertained, but to be cured. Eventually, Freud relented and agreed to see her in 1925. Marie packed her trunks, left her gay husband and her children in Paris, and boarded the train to Vienna. This was the turning point where she traveled from the world of the Lavender Marriage to the world of the talking cure, preparing to trade her tiara for the couch. The first meeting between Princess Marie Bonaparte and Sigmund Freud is a scene of profound historical weight. We can visualize the setting at 19 Berggasse, a room thick with the smell of Freud's cigars and cluttered with ancient Egyptian and Greek statuettes, antiquities that both Freud and Marie obsessed over. Marie walked in, dripping in Chanel and pearls, the very image of the entitlement Freud despised. Freud, a frail Jewish man with a white beard and piercing eyes, looked at her over his round spectacles and tested her immediately with a famous cryptic question about who the first person was to discover the existence of the floor, a metaphor for foundational psychological support. Marie lay down on the famous oriental rug-covered couch and began to talk. She spoke about her mother's death, her father's coldness, the talk, Prince George and Valdemar, and, most importantly, her inability to feel pleasure. Freud listened, and instead of judging her as society had, he analyzed her. For the first time in her life, Marie felt truly seen not as a bank account or a royal broodmare, but as a complex human being with deep, fascinating scars. The relationship blossomed with incredible speed. Freud, who had initially doubted her, was conquered by her sharp intellect and her brutal honesty, famously calling her his best student. However, it was within this sanctuary of analysis that a new tragedy began to form. Freud had a specific controversial theory about female sexuality that posited a dichotomy between two types of satisfaction. He believed that women experienced a clitoral orgasm, which he labeled as immature, infantile, and masculine in nature, and a vaginal orgasm, which he labeled as mature and the sign of a fully developed feminine woman. Freud argued that as a girl grows up, she must transfer her zone of sensitivity from the clitoris to the vagina. If she fails to do this, she is psychologically stunted. This theory, which modern science has largely debunked, was a death sentence for Marie's self-esteem. Marie confessed that she could achieve some sensation via the clitoris through masturbation, but she felt absolutely nothing vaginally during intercourse with her husband or lovers. According to Freud's framework, she was a failure of development. Instead of helping Marie accept her body's natural responses, this theory inadvertently reinforced her obsession. She became convinced that Freud was right, that she was stuck in childhood and undeveloped, and that she must find a way to physically move the sensation inside. This leads to the philosophical dark side of the story, showing how theoretical science can be dangerous when applied by an obsessive mind. Marie took Freud's descriptive theory and turned it into a prescriptive command, believing she had to have a vaginal orgasm or she wasn't a real woman. Not content to simply lie on the couch and talk, Marie reverted to her father's scientific training and decided to conduct empirical research. Using the pseudonym A.E. Narjani, she began a study that is bizarre, even by today's standards. She measured the anatomy of 243 women. One can only imagine the scene of a princess of Greece and Denmark, asking her friends, her servants, and perhaps even women in hospitals to allow her to measure the distance between their clitoris and their vaginal opening. She classified them into two groups, those she deemed frigid and those she deemed voluptuous. Her conclusion, published in medical journals, was a masterpiece of mechanical logic applied to biology. She asserted that women with a short distance, specifically less than 2.5 centimeters, were voluptuous because the clitoris was stimulated directly during intercourse. Conversely, she argued that women with a long distance like herself were frigid because there was no contact. Marie measured herself and found her distance was too far. She believed she had found the Holy Grail. The problem wasn't just the talk nightmare or the gay husband. The problem was structural engineering. She believed that if she could just move the button closer to the hole, she would be saved. It was the thinking of a mechanic trying to fix a car engine, applied to the complexities of human desire, and it was a fatal error. Armed with this self-diagnosis, Marie began to hunt for a solution. Freud's talking cure was helping her mind, but it was too slow for her body. She wanted results immediately. Her wealth once again played the role of the compensation tool. If she were a poor woman in the 1920s with sexual dysfunction, she would have lived with it. But as Marie Bonaparte, she believed she could buy a cure and purchase biology itself. She began to scour the medical world for a surgeon brave enough or reckless enough to operate. She heard of a Viennese gynecologist named Dr. Joseph Halban. Halban had a radical, unproven theory that one could surgically sever the clitoris and reattach it closer to the vagina to facilitate the elusive vaginal orgasm. Today, this sounds barbaric, a form of genital mutilation with no guarantee of success and a high risk of permanent nerve damage. But in 1927, to Marie, it looked like salvation. She told Freud of her intention. Freud, ever the skeptic, did not stop her. Perhaps he was curious, or perhaps he knew that trying to stop a Bonaparte with an obsession was like trying to stop a runaway train. The philosophy here is painful to witness. Marie believed that the entirety of a woman's happiness, her worth, and her soul could be reduced to a few centimeters of flesh. She had shrunk her vast intellect, her royal status, and her complex emotions down to a single anatomical point. It was the ultimate expression of self-loathing disguised as scientific progress. She did not know that Dr. Halban's knife would not bring pleasure. It would only bring blood, scar tissue, and a silence deeper than before. The princess was about to become the victim of her own wealth. On a cold morning in April 1927, in a private clinic in Vienna, the wealthiest woman in Europe lay strapped to an operating table. The air smelled of ether and sterilized steel. Hovering over her was Dr. Joseph Halban, a gynecologist who held a scalpel in his hand and a radical, unproven theory in his mind. He was about to perform a procedure that had no precedent in standard medical textbooks, a procedure that today would be classified as genital mutilation. The patient, Princess Marie Bonaparte, was not there because of a tumor or an infection. She was there because she believed that the geography of her own body was a mistake. She had paid a fortune for the privilege of having her most intimate anatomy sliced open, detached, and rearranged like furniture in a room. This was the moment where the obsession of the mind met the brutality of the blade. It was the Halban-Narjani operation, a desperate gamble to surgically engineer an orgasm. To understand why Marie Bonaparte climbed onto that table, we must look beyond the simple diagnosis of frigidity. We must look at the psychology of extreme wealth. Marie had spent her entire life in a world where every problem had a price tag. If a house was too small, you bought a bigger one. If a husband was gay, you bought him a yacht to keep him happy. If a government was unstable, you wrote a check. Her reality was malleable. She had internalized the belief that there was no such thing as an immutable fact, only a negotiation. When she looked at her own body and found it wanting, she didn't see a biological destiny. She saw a construction error. And construction errors could be fixed if you hired the right contractor. Her decision to undergo surgery was the ultimate act of hubris. It was the belief that her will, backed by the Blanc casino fortune, was stronger than nature itself. She approached Dr. Halban not as a patient seeking healing, but as a patron commissioning a work of art. She wanted him to sculpt her a new capacity for feeling. She ignored the warnings of the risks because, in her experience, risk was something poor people faced. Princesses were protected. She was about to learn that biology is the one jurisdiction where money has no currency. Dr. Joseph Halban was a respected man in his field, but he was also an opportunist. He had theorized that the reason many women failed to achieve vaginal orgasms was purely mechanical. The clitoris was simply too far away from the vaginal canal to be stimulated by the friction of intercourse. His solution was terrifyingly simple. He proposed to cut the clitoris free from its upper attachments, creating a flap of tissue, and then suture it lower down, closer to the vaginal opening. Let us visualize the brutality of this in 1927. There were no microsurgical techniques. There were no lasers. This was surgery with a knife and needle. It was invasive, bloody, and traumatic. The theory completely ignored the complex network of nerves that supply the pelvic region. By severing the suspensory ligaments and moving the tissue, Halban risked severing the very nerves that provided sensation. He was treating the clitoris like a dead piece of leather that could be moved at will rather than a living, electrified organ. Marie went into the surgery with the wide-eyed optimism of a child. She had convinced herself that this was a scientific breakthrough, akin to the discovery of penicillin or the X-ray. She saw herself as a pioneer. She didn't realize she was a guinea pig. As the anesthesia mask was lowered over her face, she likely thought that when she woke up, the talk would finally be gone, replaced by the flood of pleasure she had read about in books but never felt. The days following the surgery were a haze of agony. The pelvic region is rich in nerve endings, and the trauma of the incision was severe. Marie lay in her hospital bed in Vienna, bandaged and drugged, waiting for the healing to begin. But even through the pain, her obsession burned bright. She wasn't focusing on the wound. She was focusing on the future. She was like a runner who had just undergone knee surgery, dreaming of the marathon. She wrote letters to Freud during this period. They are heartbreaking documents of delusion. She speaks of her great hope. She speaks of the correction of her nature. She framed the pain as a necessary penance, a fire she had to walk through to be purified of her frigidity. Freud, to his credit, remained cautious. He visited her, he comforted her, but he did not feed her delusion. He knew perhaps better than anyone that the roots of her problem lay in the nursery of Saint-Cloud, in the dead mother and the cold father, not in the placement of her anatomy. But he also knew that Marie needed to believe in the knife because she had stopped believing in the word. Weeks passed. The stitches were removed, the swelling subsided, the scar tissue began to form. And then came the moment of the test. Marie returned to her life and inevitably to her experiments. She needed to know if the procedure had worked. She took a lover, perhaps a new one, perhaps an old one, and initiated intimacy. The drama-filled contradiction of this moment is excruciating. She had endured the knife. She had endured the recovery. She had paid the fortune. She lay back waiting for the miracle. She waited for the earth to move, and nothing happened. Actually, it was worse than nothing. The scar tissue had made the area less sensitive. The nerves had been damaged. The sensation was duller, more distant than before. Instead of bringing the fire closer, the surgery had put a layer of ice over it. Imagine the crushing weight of that silence. The realization didn't come all at once. It came in a slow, creeping tide of horror. She tried again and again. She blamed the partner. She blamed the angle. She blamed her own mind for not relaxing enough. But deep down, the scientist in her knew the data was irrefutable. The experiment had failed. The Halban Narjani operation was a fraud. She was still Marie. She was still frigid. But now she was scarred. A rational person would have stopped there. A rational person would have accepted that the body is not a machine to be tinkered with. But Marie Bonaparte was not rational. She was obsessive. And obsession does not accept defeat. Instead of rejecting the surgery, she rejected the outcome. She convinced herself that perhaps the surgery hadn't been radical enough. Perhaps it needed a revision. Perhaps she needed a different procedure. In a display of tenacity that borders on madness, Marie Bonaparte underwent the knife again and again. Historical records vary on the exact number of procedures, but she subjected herself to further gynecological surgeries in a frantic attempt to correct the failure of the first. She was chasing a phantom. She was like a gambler in her grandfather's casino, doubling down on a losing hand, convinced that the next spin of the wheel would bring the jackpot. She effectively mutilated herself in slow motion over the course of several years. She turned her body into a battlefield, scarring the very site where she sought pleasure. It was a tragic loop. The more she cut, the less she felt, and the less she felt, the more she wanted to cut. It was Sigmund Freud who finally had to act as the voice of reality. He watched his favorite student destroying herself and realized that psychoanalysis had hit a hard biological wall. He famously said, "The biological is the bedrock." He meant that there are limits to how much we can change. We are born with certain constitutions, certain limitations, and no amount of talking or cutting can alter the fundamental architecture of the self. Freud's eventual dismissal of her surgical quest was gentle but firm. He helped her to see that her pursuit of the vaginal orgasm was a proxy war. She wasn't really fighting for an orgasm. She was fighting for normalcy. She was fighting to prove that she wasn't the broken child of a dead mother. She was fighting to prove that she was a woman capable of love. The failure of the surgery forced Marie to confront the psychological taboo head on. She had to accept that she would never be normal in the way medical textbooks defined it. She had to learn to live with her talk, with her numbness, with her unique and fractured self. By 1930, the surgical phase of her life was largely over. Marie Bonaparte was 48 years old. She was arguably the most famous female psychoanalyst in the world. She was a princess of Greece. She was a mother. But underneath her silk dresses, she carried the physical map of her desperation. She carried the scars of Dr. Halban's knife. These scars were a secret symbol. To the world, she was the picture of poise and power. To herself, she was a war veteran who had lost the war. The vivid visuals of her later years often show her sitting with a certain rigidity, a certain sadness in her eyes. It was the look of a woman who had tried to force the door of paradise open and had broken her hands banging on it. The surgery didn't cure her frigidity, but it cured her naivety. It taught her the brutal lesson that her wealth had shielded her from for so long. You cannot buy your way out of your own skin. Her story is a dark parable about the modern obsession with self-improvement. Marie was an early adopter of the idea that we are projects to be optimized. She treated her body like hardware that needed an upgrade. But the human body is not hardware. It is a mystery. Marie's tragedy was that she viewed her lack of pleasure as a failure of machinery rather than a complex interplay of emotion, history, and chemistry. The knife of Dr. Halban cut deep, but it didn't cut out the root of the problem. The root was the little girl in the nursery of St. Cloud, terrified of her father, guilty over her mother, and lonely in her golden cage. No surgeon can operate on a memory. No scalpel can excise a ghost. Marie Bonaparte survived the butcher, but she did not leave the table whole. She left a piece of her hope in that clinic in Vienna. And as the 1930s darkened and the shadow of the swastika began to fall over Europe, Marie would find that she needed her strength for a different kind of fight. She couldn't save her own body, but perhaps with her money and her will, she could save the mind of the man who had tried to help her. In March 1938, the history of the 20th century snapped shut like a steel trap. The Wehrmacht crossed the border into Austria. The Anschluss was complete. Overnight, Vienna, the glittering capital of culture, music, and psychology, was transformed into a prison camp. Swastika flags draped the opera house. Brown shirts roamed the Ringstrasse, beating Jews and forcing them to scrub pavements with toothbrushes. In the center of this nightmare, at Berggasse 19, sat an 81-year-old man. He was dying of jaw cancer. He was Jewish. And he was the author of books the Nazis were burning in public bonfires. Sigmund Freud was marked for extinction. Most of the world looked away. Governments sent polite letters of protest but refused to issue visas. The scientific community was paralyzed by fear, but one woman did not look away. Princess Marie Bonaparte, the woman who had spent years lying on Freud's couch trying to cure her own frozen body, now stood up. She realized that her failed surgeries and her sexual obsessions were trivial compared to the catastrophe unfolding before her. She reached into her purse and pulled out the only weapon that the Nazis respected: gold. This chapter is the story of the Golden Shield. It is the moment when the casino money of the Blanc family, money made from the vices of gamblers, became the ransom for the greatest mind of the age. It is the story of how a neurotic princess became a savior, proving that while money cannot buy happiness, it can occasionally buy life. To act as a detective in this historical moment, we must first solve a riddle. Why was Freud still in Vienna? The Nazis had been in power in Germany since 1933. The threat was visible from space. Yet Freud, The man who had mapped the darkest corners of the human unconscious was strangely blind to the darkness of politics. He was stubborn. He was old. He believed that Austria would protect him. He famously said, "They will not treat me like this. I am Freud." Marie Bonaparte saw what the genius could not. From her vantage point in Paris, traveling between the royal courts of Europe, she saw the storm clouds gathering. She understood the nature of the Nazi beast. It was not rational. It was primal. It was the id unleashed on a national scale. She pleaded with Freud in letters to leave. He refused. He was like a captain refusing to leave a sinking ship, convinced the hull was unsinkable. When the news of the Anschluss broke on March 12, 1938, Marie did not send a telegram. She packed a bag. She left the safety of France and boarded a train into the heart of the Third Reich. It was an act of physical courage that contradicted her reputation as a fragile, neurotic socialite. The woman who was afraid of buttons and drafts was now walking directly toward the Gestapo. Marie arrived in Vienna to find a city in the grip of hysteria. She went straight to Berggasse 19. The atmosphere in the apartment was funereal. Freud was frail, unable to speak clearly due to his prosthesis. His wife, Martha, was terrified. And then the knocking came. The Gestapo arrived to inspect the apartment. This was the opening move of the shakedown. They were looking for money, for incriminating documents, for excuses to arrest. There is a legendary story, perhaps embellished, but spiritually true, that Marie Bonaparte sat in the hallway during the raid. When the Gestapo officers entered, arrogant and thuggish, they found a princess of Greece and Denmark sitting there, reading a book. She looked up at them with the imperious glare of a Bonaparte. She didn't speak. She just existed. Her presence was a golden shield. The Nazis were bullies, but they were also snobs. They didn't know what to do with a royal highness. They could beat a Jewish doctor, but could they arrest the cousin of the King of England and the wife of a Greek prince? She bought the family time simply by sitting in a chair, but the shield had cracks. On March 22nd, the Gestapo took Anna Freud, Sigmund's daughter and intellectual heir, for interrogation. This was the tragedy at the center of the rescue. Freud loved Anna more than anything. As she was led away, the old man crumbled. He spent the day pacing his study, smoking endlessly, fearing that his beloved daughter was being tortured in a basement at the Hotel Metropole. Marie Bonaparte waited with him. She saw the father of psychoanalysis reduced to a terrified parent. She knew that if Anna did not return, Freud would die of grief. Marie began to work the phones. She called the American ambassador. She called her royal connections. She made it clear to the authorities in Vienna that if anything happened to Anna Freud, there would be a diplomatic incident that would echo across the world. Anna was released that evening. She returned home, shaken but alive. But the message was clear. The next time, they wouldn't bring her back. They had to leave. Now. The decision was made to flee to London. But the Nazis did not let Jews leave for free. They had instituted the Reichsfluchtsteuer, a sadistic bureaucratic tool designed to strip immigrants of every penny they owned before kicking them out. They assessed Freud's assets. They demanded a fortune. Freud did not have the cash. His books had been banned. His bank accounts were frozen or watched. The Nazis demanded an exorbitant sum, often cited as around 4,824 Reichsmarks, plus other fees that amounted to a king's ransom. The Nazis were essentially holding the brain of the 20th century hostage. Marie Bonaparte didn't hesitate. She opened her checkbook. This is the moment of redemption for the Blanc money. For decades, Marie had felt guilty about her fortune. It was sin money, earned from the misery of gamblers in Monte Carlo. It was the money that had killed her mother and alienated her father. But now that dirty money was being washed clean. She paid the flight tax. She paid the bribes. She paid the visa fees. She essentially bought Sigmund Freud from Adolf Hitler. It was a transaction between the two poles of humanity, the woman who wanted to save a mind and the regime that wanted to destroy it. It wasn't just the people. Marie knew that Freud was his work. She couldn't save him if she left his soul behind. She organized the smuggling of his famous antiquities, the thousands of statues, the books, the couch, the physical landscape of psychoanalysis. The Nazis wanted to confiscate everything as cultural heritage. Marie used her diplomatic immunity. She claimed the items belonged to her, or she bribed the customs officials to look the other way. She turned Berggasse 19 into a packing crate. She was the logistics manager of the Exodus. The vivid visual here is striking. The wealthy princess, on her knees in the dust, wrapping Egyptian statuettes in newspaper, while Freud sat in the corner, watching his life being dismantled. However, no rescue is perfect. This story has a dark hamartia, not of Marie, but of the situation. Freud had 4 elderly sisters, Rosa, Marie, Adolphine, and Pauline. They also lived in Vienna. When the plans were being made for Freud, Martha, and Anna to leave, the question of the sisters arose. Freud, in a moment of terrible denial or perhaps exhaustion, believed they would be safe. He thought the Nazis would not bother for old women. He also knew he could barely get visas for his immediate family. The British authorities were strict. They didn't want a flood of refugees. Marie Bonaparte tried. She looked for loopholes. But her money had limits. She could buy Freud, but she couldn't buy everyone. The sisters were left behind. This is the ghost that haunts the rescue. A few years later, all 4 sisters were deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. They were eventually murdered in the gas chambers of Treblinka and Auschwitz. Marie Bonaparte saved the genius, but she couldn't save the aunts. It is said that Freud died before he knew their fate. But Marie lived with the knowledge. She had played Schindler, but her list was too short. June 4th, 1938. The Westbahnhof station in Vienna. The Freud family boarded the Orient Express for Paris, the first leg of their journey to London. Marie Bonaparte was there to escort them. The train was stopped at the border at Kehl. The German guards boarded. This was the final test. They looked at the passports. They saw the J stamped on them. They looked at the frail old man. And then they looked at the woman sitting opposite him, the princess with the Bonaparte name and the Greek title. She stared them down. The guards stamped the passports. The train lurched forward. They crossed the bridge over the Rhine. They were in France. Freud turned to Marie and reportedly said, "I am free." They stopped in Paris. Marie welcomed Freud to her home as a conquering hero. For a few days, the patient became the hostess. She served him tea in her garden. She introduced him to her friends. It was the high water mark of her life. The woman who couldn't feel an orgasm felt a rush of purpose that was stronger than any physical sensation. She had defied the devil and won. She arranged for his final passage to London, where he would live out his last year in freedom at 20 Maresfield Gardens. When Freud died in September 1939, just weeks after World War II officially began, he died in a free bed, thanks to Marie. To Marie Bonaparte, this specific life was worth her entire fortune. Why? Because Freud had given her something no one else had. He had given her a narrative. He hadn't cured her frigidity, but he had listened to her. He had validated her pain. By saving him, she was repaying a debt of the soul. This act fundamentally changed Marie. Before 1938, she was a rich neurotic obsessed with her own genitals. After 1938, she was a historical figure. She had sublimated her libido into action. She proved that wealth is morally neutral. In the hands of her grandfather, it built a casino that ruined lives. In the hands of Marie, it built a lifeboat that saved a legacy. She couldn't fix her own biology, so she fixed history instead. History often presents the European monarchies as pillars of stability, draped in ermine and gold, ruling by divine right. But if you peel back the curtain of the mid-20th century, you find a very different reality. You find a group of homeless, stateless, and penniless refugees living out of suitcases in London, Cairo, and Cape Town. The kings of Greece, Yugoslavia, and Romania were not sitting on thrones. They were sitting in hotel lobbies waiting for someone to pay the bill. And for the Greek royal family, that someone was Princess Marie Bonaparte. As the world collapsed into the fire of World War II and the subsequent Greek Civil War, Marie Bonaparte transformed. She was no longer the neurotic patient lying on Freud's couch. She became the iron banker of a fallen dynasty. She used the limitless wealth of the Blanc Casino empire to prop up a family that had lost everything but its pride. She paid for the suits, the schools, the medical bills, and the dignity of kings. She couldn't be a real royal by blood, so she bought her status by becoming the indispensable landlord of the monarchy. This is the story of how Marie Bonaparte became the matriarch of Exile, ruling over a kingdom of debt and dysfunction. Before the war fully descended, a personal tragedy struck that reshuffled the psychological deck of Marie's marriage. In 1939, Prince Valdemar of Denmark died. For 30 years, Valdemar had been the invisible third in Marie's marriage, the man who held her husband's heart. His death devastated Prince George. The giant, gruff Greek prince collapsed into a state of infantile grief. He wept openly. He was inconsolable. Here lies the supreme irony of Marie's life. She found herself in the position of comforting her husband over the death of his male lover. A normal wife might have felt a secret relief or a surge of jealousy. But Marie, with her psychoanalytic training and her obsession with acceptance, took on the role of the therapist. She managed George's grief just as she managed his bank accounts. She realized that with Valdemar gone, George was entirely hers for the first time. But he was a broken vessel. He reverted to a state of emotional dependency on Marie, clinging to her not as a lover, but as a mother figure. The Lavender Marriage shifted from a triangle to a nursing home. Marie was now the caretaker of a man who was widowed by another man. Then came the war. In 1940, the Nazi war machine rolled into France. Marie Bonaparte, who had defied the Gestapo in Vienna to save Freud, knew she pushed her luck too far. She was a Bonaparte, a symbol of French imperialism, and a known anti-Nazi. She had to run. The flight of the Greek royal family reads like an adventure novel, but the subtext is purely financial. They fled Paris to the south of France, then to Greece. But Greece fell to the Axis powers in 1941. The king of Greece and the rest of the clan had to evacuate. They fled to Crete, then to Egypt, and finally many of them ended up in South Africa and London. Throughout this chaotic exodus, Marie was the logistics manager. While the real royals debated politics and military strategy, Marie was the one booking the tickets, bribing the captains, and securing the hotel suites. She carried her jewelry, the famous Bonaparte diamonds, sewn into her clothes or hidden in nondescript bags. These stones were the emergency fund for the entire dynasty. The detective, looking at this period, sees a shift in power. In peacetime, the royals tolerated Marie because of her money, but looked down on her casino blood. In wartime, when the throne was gone and the palaces were occupied, Marie's liquid cash made her the most powerful person in the family. The hierarchy flipped. The banker was now the queen. Marie and George spent much of the war in Cape Town, South Africa. This period serves as a perfect laboratory to observe Marie's psychological taboo in a new setting. Stripped of the distractions of Paris society and the intense sessions with Freud, Marie had to live with her own mind. She didn't knit socks for soldiers. She wrote books. She continued her psychoanalytic work, analyzing the racism of South African society, analyzing the trauma of war, and analyzing her own family. She turned her exile into a field study, but the domestic reality remained bizarre. She lived with George in a strange, suspended animation. Without the invisible third and without her own lovers, Marie and George developed a companionable, sexless intimacy. They were two shipwreck survivors on a raft. George would tell endless, repetitive stories about his youth in the Navy, and Marie would nod, mentally dissecting his Oedipus complex while he spoke. It was a marriage held together by the glue of shared displacement. While Marie was writing in Cape Town, the rest of the family was scattered and destitute. We must look at the specific beneficiaries of her golden shield. There was Prince Andrew of Greece, George's brother. Andrew was the father of Prince Philip. Andrew was a tragic figure, exiled, nearly executed by the Greek revolutionary government in 1922, and living a dissolute life in Monte Carlo in France. He died penniless in 1944. Who paid for his lifestyle? Who paid his debts? Often it was Marie. And young Prince Philip, shuffling between boarding schools in Scotland and relatives in Germany, was part of this ecosystem of genteel poverty that Marie helped sustain. While Philip was cared for by his Mountbatten uncles in England, the broader safety net of the Greek family was woven with Marie's gold. Marie paid for the education of her own children, Peter and Eugenie. She supported cousins and aunts who had fled the Balkans with nothing but the clothes on their backs. This creates a drama-filled contradiction. Marie was the outsider, the Bonaparte, the woman with the dirty money. Yet she was the life support system for the pure-blooded royals who had sneered at her father. She was buying their survival, and in doing so, she was buying their silence. They couldn't afford to mock her frigidity or her eccentric theories when she was paying for their dinner. When World War II ended in 1945, the tragedy for Greece was just beginning. The country descended into a brutal civil war between communists and royalists. The monarchy was restored, then threatened, then restored again. Marie and George returned to Europe. They couldn't go back to their beloved Paris home immediately, so they lived a nomadic existence. Marie threw herself into the cause of the Greek monarchy. Why? She wasn't Greek. She was French. She was a Republican by birth. But she understood that her social status, her identity, was inextricably linked to the crown. If the Greek monarchy fell, she was just a rich widow. If it stood, she was a royal highness. So she funded the PR campaigns. She lobbied politicians. She used her wealth to project an image of stability for a family that was crumbling. There is a deep psychological connection between her philanthropy and her sexual dysfunction. Freud had taught her about sublimation, the process of channeling sexual energy into social or intellectual pursuits. Marie Bonaparte is the ultimate example of sublimation. Because she couldn't create life, she sustained life through money. Her checkbook became her reproductive organ. Every check she wrote was a substitute for the orgasm she never had. She derived a cold, controlling pleasure from being the benefactor. It gave her a sense of potency. I cannot make my husband desire me, she might have thought, but I can make him need me. Dependency is a form of intimacy. It is a toxic, unequal form, but for a woman terrified of abandonment, it is a safe bet. If they owe you everything, they can never leave you. However, the tragedy of the exiled matriarch is that gratitude is not love. The royals took her money, but they remained distant. They found her psychoanalytic talk exhausting. They found her obsession with sex embarrassing. Marie would sit at dinner parties, talking loudly about phallic symbols and incest taboos, while the conservative Greek and Danish royals stared at their plates in horror. She was the eccentric aunt, the crazy rich relative. She was surrounded by family, yet she was utterly alone. George was mentally fading, lost in his memories of Valdemar. Her children were grown and had their own troubled lives. Marie retreated more and more into her work. She translated Freud's works into French. She helped establish the Paris Psychoanalytic Society. She wrote books on Edgar Allan Poe and female sexuality. Her desk became her kingdom. Her pen was her scepter. By the 1950s, Marie Bonaparte was an old woman. The wars were over. The Greek monarchy was temporarily stable. Marie looked at the world she had bought. It was secure. Her husband was comfortable. Her name was respected in scientific circles. But the talk was still there. The emptiness was still there. She realized that wealth had solved every problem except the one that mattered. She had saved Freud from the Nazis, but she hadn't saved herself from her own nature. She had supported a king, but she hadn't found a lover. Marie proved that money is a powerful tool for survival. It can defeat the Gestapo. It can defeat poverty. It can defeat exile. But it cannot defeat the self. The golden shield protected her body, but it trapped her soul. She remained the little girl in the nursery of Saint Cloud, waiting for a warmth that never came, surrounded by cold, hard gold. In the end, even the most complex case files must be closed. For 70 years, Marie Bonaparte treated her own life as a mystery to be solved. She dissected her dreams, measured her anatomy, analyzed her husband, and spent a fortune trying to bribe biology into submission. She was the princess who wanted to be a scientist, the patient who wanted to be a doctor, and the woman who wanted to be whole. But as the 1950s turned into the 1960s, the Golden Princess faced the one adversary that cannot be negotiated with, bribed, or psychoanalyzed: death. Did the surgeries work? Did the money bring peace? Did the acceptance of her husband's homosexuality eventually turn into love? Or did it remain a cold treaty until the bitter end? We are about to witness the final days of the last great Bonaparte. It is the story of a woman who saved everyone else: Freud, the Greek royals, the Jews of Vienna, but who died still searching for the key to her own locked room. The first domino to fall in the finale of her life was Prince George. By 1957, the Greek god who had dazzled Marie in 1907 was a shadow of himself. He was 88 years old, frail, and lost in the fog of memory. For decades, their marriage had been a lavender arrangement, a partnership of convenience built on the acceptance of his love for his uncle Valdemar. But when George finally lay dying in a hospital in Saint Cloud, a strange transformation occurred. The invisible third was gone. The sexual disappointment was ancient history. All that remained were two people who had weathered the storms of the 20th century together. Marie sat by his bedside for days. She wasn't the passionate lover he had never wanted, nor the bank manager he had needed. She was his witness. When Prince George died on November the 25th, 1957, Marie's reaction was complex. It was not the shattering grief of a romance loss, but the deep, resonant ache of an era ending. She wrote about the great silence that descended upon her life. For 50 years, her identity had been tied to this giant, difficult homosexual man. She had defined herself in opposition to him, his intellect against her intellect, his body against her body. With him gone, she was no longer the neglected wife or the patient savior. She was simply a widow, alone in a house filled with ghosts and gold. After George's death, Marie entered her twilight years as a relic of a vanished world. She was one of the last living links to the imperial glory of France and the golden age of psychoanalysis. She continued to work with a ferocity that defied her age. She translated Freud. She lectured. She fought battles within the International Psychoanalytical Association to defend the practice of lay analysis, a cause close to her heart because she herself was not a medical doctor. But the detective, looking at her final years, sees a woman still haunted by her original demon, the talk. The fear of death, which Freud termed thanatos, began to replace the fear of sex. Marie had spent her life trying to unlock the secrets of pleasure, believing that the orgasm was the ultimate affirmation of life. Now facing the inevitability of her own extinction, she turned her analytical eye toward the process of dying. She wrote extensively about the psychology of aging, trying to intellectualize her fear, just as she had tried to intellectualize her frigidity. She treated death as the final castration, the ultimate loss of power for a woman who had spent her life accumulating it. In 1962, the diagnosis came. It was acute leukemia, the white blood, as it was poetically and horrifically known. For a woman who had obsessed over the biological machinery of her body, this was the final betrayal. Her blood, the famous Bonaparte blood, mixed with the Blanc Casino blood, was turning against her. Marie met this diagnosis with the stoicism of a scientist. She did not pray for a miracle. She was a staunch atheist, a disciple of Freud's rationalism to the end. She observed her symptoms, charted her decline, and prepared for the end with a grim efficiency. However, there is a poignant tragedy in her physical decline. This was the body she had mutilated in the search for feeling. She had cut it, rearranged it, and measured it, all in the hope of making it a vessel of joy. Now, it was becoming a vessel of pain. The irony was cruel. She had spent her life trying to feel more, and now, in her final months, she was forced to rely on morphine to feel less. The sensation she finally achieved was not the ecstasy of the vaginal orgasm, but the oblivion of the narcotic. As she lay dying in her villa in Saint-Tropez, Marie surely reflected on her intellectual legacy. She had written books on female sexuality, arguing passionately for the very theories that had tormented her. She had championed Freud's idea that vaginal orgasm was the marker of maturity. History, however, has been unkind to this specific part of her work. The sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s and the modern understanding of anatomy would later prove her wrong. The clitoral orgasm she dismissed was, in fact, the norm. The surgery she endured was unnecessary torture. This leads to a heartbreaking philosophical realization. Marie Bonaparte sacrificed her body on the altar of a false god. She mutilated herself to fit a theory that turned out to be a myth. She was a martyr to a scientific error. But to dismiss her life as a failure because of this would be to miss the point. Her greatness lay not in her conclusions, but in her courage to ask the questions. In an era when female sexuality was a black hole of silence, Marie Bonaparte dared to speak. She dared to say, "I am not satisfied." She dared to demand more from her existence than just being a decorative princess. Her tragedy paved the way for future generations of women to understand their bodies without the shame that crippled her. The final aspect of our investigation must be the verdict on wealth. Marie Bonaparte died as she lived, fabulously rich. Her fortune had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the collapse of monarchies. But what did it buy her? It bought her entry into the royal family, but it couldn't buy her husband's desire. It bought her the attention of Sigmund Freud, but it couldn't buy a cure for her neurosis. It bought the Lavender surgery, but it couldn't buy pleasure. It bought the safety of the Greek royal family, but it couldn't buy their love, only their gratitude. Yet we cannot say the money was wasted. The golden shield worked. It saved Freud. It saved the cultural heritage of psychoanalysis. It kept a dynasty alive during its darkest hour. Marie proved that money is a tool of survival, not satisfaction. It can protect you from the wolves outside the door, but it cannot protect you from the wolves inside your head. She died in luxury, surrounded by the beautiful things she had collected, but the internal void, the space where the talk lived, remained unfilled. On September 21st, 1962, Princess Marie Bonaparte died in Saint-Tropez. She was 80 years old. She was cremated in Marseille, a final break with royal tradition, which usually demanded burial. Her ashes were taken to Greece, to Tatoi, to rest beside her husband, Prince George. Even in death, she accepted her place in the Lavender Marriage. She lies for eternity next to the man who loved his uncle more than he loved her. But perhaps in the silence of the grave, the psychological taboo no longer matters. Perhaps they are finally equals, stripped of their titles, their money, and their conflicting desires. So, who was Marie Bonaparte? Was she the victim of a cold father and a dead mother? Was she the dupe of a gay husband? Was she the guinea pig of a reckless surgeon? Or was she a hero who used her privilege to fight the darkness of her time? The answer is that she was all of them. She was a woman of drama-filled contradictions. She was a frigid sexologist, a royal republican, an atheist who served a divine right monarchy. Her life was a testament to the complexity of the human condition. She proved that you can be the richest woman in the world and still be a beggar for love. She proved that you can save the world and still be unable to save yourself. Her story is a dark mirror held up to our own obsessions with perfection, with fixing ourselves, with the belief that there is a magical cure for the pain of being human. Marie Bonaparte tried everything: the prince, the lover, the doctor, the surgeon. None of them worked. The only thing that worked in the end was her work itself, her sublimation. She turned her pain into ink. She turned her gold into life for others. And in that transformation, the frigid princess finally found a kind of warmth. It wasn't the warmth of passion, but the warmth of a legacy that endures long after the money is spent and the scars have faded. And that is the incredible, tragic, and deeply disturbing story of Princess Marie Bonaparte, the heiress who bought a prince, the patient who saved Freud, the woman who cut her own body in search of a feeling she never found. Her life asks us a brutal question. If you had all the money in the world, could you buy your way out of your own unhappiness? Marie tried, and her failure is the most expensive lesson in history. She teaches us that we are not machines to be fixed. We are mysteries to be lived. If this deep dive into the darkest corners of royal psychology touched you, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us bring these forgotten ghosts back into the light. Tell me in the comments, do you think Marie was a hero for saving Freud or a victim of her own obsessions? Thank you for watching the story of the frigid princess. Rest in peace, Marie. The experiment is over.